Today we are starting a new worship series that will explore the life of Moses. The purpose of this series is twofold. First, we will explore his life from both a faith and historical perspective. Second, we will explore how this ancient story is still relevant when it comes to living out our faith in the modern world. A big part of our journey will be guided by the book Moses, following in the footsteps of a reluctant prophet by Adam Hamilton. Adam is one of my favorite authors because he has a passion for making the academic side of our faith come alive in some really important ways. I want to start by reminding you where the story of Moses takes place. This is a map of a portion of the Middle East. Here is Egypt. This is the Nile River. This is where the Nile River Delta is, and that area contains the most fertile soil in the region. This part of the Nile River Delta is called the land of Goshen. Eventually, the story of the Exodus will take the people of Israel across the Red Sea, into the Sinai Peninsula, and all the way up, where they will cross over the Jordan River into the Promised Land. Now, when you think of ancient Egypt, part of what comes to mind is often the pyramids. The first pyramid was built around 2600 BC, which is 1,000 years before Moses lived, which means that Moses walked among the ancient pyramids. He lived in their shadows. But he didn't just live in the shadows of the pyramids. Moses lived in the shadows of the men who built them, men called Pharaoh. They were the most powerful men in the world at that time, and they built pyramids and other large temples, not only as a burial place, but as a statement of their power and authority. I wanted to mention this because it is important to remember that Moses, a man with very little political or social power, is going to go face to face with one of those pharaohs, something very few people ever did and survived. It is also worth remembering that the story of Moses took place in a much larger cultural setting than we often have in mind when we study this period of our faith history. The Israelites were a small part of a much larger historical setting. This was a thriving and large-scale civilization that we are talking about here. In order to understand the story of Moses, we have to remember how it began. Before Moses was born, there was a guy named Joseph. You may remember him as the one with the amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Well, Joseph was very close to the Pharaoh who was ruling at that time. He served him so well that this Pharaoh named him as the governor of all of Egypt and would eventually give him and the people of Israel a permanent home in one of the most fertile parts of Egypt, the land of Goshen, which we identified on the map a moment ago. Eventually, Joseph died, and so did the Pharaoh he served. But even after Joseph's death, the Hebrew people continued to grow in number to the point that the land was filled with them. It is here that the story of Moses begins, and it started with these words. Now a new king arose over Egypt, who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." To control the Israelites, the Egyptians began to oppress them fiercely, forcing them into hard labor and working them beyond any reasonable amount. Yet the more severe the oppressive the efforts got, the more numerous the Hebrew people became. And the Egyptians began to fear them even more. So they increased their cruelty toward them. Ultimately, their fear grew to such a point that Pharaoh told the midwives who served the Hebrews to kill every male infant while it was still in the birth canal, telling the parents that it was dead when born. When we hear this story, it is easy for us to wonder how someone could be so evil and cruel as to kill an innocent child. especially given that the Hebrews were not rebelling in any way. But fear is a powerful thing, and it can lead people to act in irrational, illogical, and even evil ways. The specific fear at the root of this story is what we call xenophobia, which is from the Greek, literally meaning fear of the stranger or foreigner. It is a fear based on the unknown, and it is fed by assumptions, prejudices, and an underlying lack of knowledge about the other. If not caught and stopped early, it can cause one group of people to start demeaning and dehumanizing another group of people, even to the point of seeing them as a monstrous threat. Once that happens, it doesn't take much for fears to turn into hatred. That hatred can lead to cruelty, and then to the point where people start justifying severe oppression and violence. There are multiple examples of this throughout human history. The most prevalent in recent history was the rise of Nazism in Germany. Their xenophobia was so strong, it led to the attempted genocide of an entire race of people, as well as those who were gay, disabled, Roma, or being of a race other than Caucasian. They killed millions of people, including children, because they were different. Of course, xenophobia doesn't have to play out in such extreme ways for it to cause harm to an innocent group of people. The COVID-19 pandemic led to xenophobic attitudes and behaviors toward Asians and people of Asian descent, some of which led to violence. Using demeaning or dehumanizing language when we speak about different nationalities, races, religion, or cultures, or talking about people in ways that makes them the other is xenophobic. And if we let these fears get the best of us, nothing good can come out of it. The Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, is very concerned about xenophobia because the Israelites were on the receiving end of it a lot, including in the story we are looking at today. This is why there are such strong biblical teachings about how we are supposed to treat refugees, immigrants, and strangers in our midst. Here are just a couple of examples of those laws. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. When an alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the native born among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. The laws in these passages come from an important context. They were meant to serve as a reminder of the suffering the Israelites experienced when they were on the receiving end of xenophobia. God wanted to make sure that when the Israelites lived in a land of their own and had power over others, that they would not treat other people the way they were treated. This was part of God's plan to stop the cycle of xenophobia. Another part of God's plan to stop the cycle of xenophobia is something the book of Romans identifies as one of the essential marks of a true Christian: Philoxenia, which means the love of the stranger or foreigner. The idea of Philoxenia is found throughout Scripture, but it is most profoundly seen in the life, ministry, and teaching of Jesus Christ, who talks about the love of the stranger, the foreigner, and people often viewed as the other over and over again. He even goes so far as to say that we are called to love our enemies. This is not just some rhetorical device. Jesus meant it. There is no doubt that God's design for humanity is that we love each other. Now, to be clear, living out the call of Philoxenia does not mean we have to abandon all reason and act in ways that do not provide self-care and protection. Of course we can do that. That said, the call of our faith is that the baseline of how we treat others is love. We start with love. We act in love. We strive for love. When our baseline becomes fear instead of love, we have lost our way, and we certainly aren't reflecting the teachings of our faith. The story of Moses makes the dangers of xenophobia very clear. My hope is that we can hear that lesson and strive to find ways to follow Christ's call to live into Philoxenia as faithfully as we possibly can. I want to turn our attention now back to the midwives that were commanded to kill the male infants. Their names were Shiphrah and Puah. Scripture tells us that they loved the Lord more than they feared Pharaoh, and so they refused to do what he commanded. Instead, they conspired to lie to Pharaoh, saying that the Hebrew women were so strong that they kept having the babies before they could arrive. And once they were born, the chance to take their lives in a secret way was lost. Talk about living into Philoxenia. They loved the other so much that they were willing to risk their lives in order to fight back against the fear and hate that was overtaking so many in Egypt. Because of their faith and bravery, God honored these women and blessed them and their families. Their story reminds us of the importance of something we must always remember. While Scripture teaches us that we are called to be good and faithful citizens, it also makes it clear that as a people of faith, our primary allegiance is to God. Our loyalty to God and our call to walk in the way of Jesus always comes before our loyalty to any earthly power, ruler, and nation. Ultimately, our hope as a people of faith is to find ways to balance our allegiances and commitment to these things, and for the most part, we can usually find ways of doing that. However, there are times when we have to choose. There are times when earthly governments act in ways that are decidedly not reflective of God's will for humankind. And when that happens, we are called to follow in the footsteps of Shiphrah and Puah. We saw an example of this during the civil rights movement. There were many laws in place at that time that codified the oppression and mistreatment of others. In order to help challenge those laws, people had to sometimes break them in ways that forced the issue. They had to sit at restaurant counters and in the front of the bus. They had to show up and force that their right to vote be honored. They had to stand against laws that made it legal to treat people as less than fully human based on nothing more than the color of their skin. While we must discern carefully before engaging in civil disobedience, and while we must be sure as we can about our motives, there are times when we may have to choose which authority we ultimately serve. And we may have to make some hard decisions about how we will respond. But as Christ followers, we don't get to just sit back and watch others suffer injustice. Instead, we are duty-bound by our faith to respond. Of course, each of us may understand and define injustice differently, and that's okay. We are a diverse body of believers, and it is good and right that we see the world differently. That said, the lens through which we look at this world is meant to be the lens of faith. Therefore, the decision to take a stand or to let something go must be rooted in faith, even when the teachings of our faith challenge something we hold true. That's one of the many reasons it is so vital to be in community with people who think differently than we do. We balance each other. We hold each other accountable. We support each other. And above all else, we love each other, even when we disagree. Now, being in that kind of community can be hard sometimes, but it is really a gift. And I thank God that this church is that kind of community. I want to point something out to you that is easily overlooked in this story. While we know the names of the two midwives, Scripture never tells us the name of this Pharaoh. There is a message there, and it is clear. God honors those who honor God first, especially when living out their faith comes at a cost. So let us remember the names of Shiphrah and Puah and what they did for the sake of others, Their actions are the embodiment of Philoxenia, and they are models of what it looks like to be a person of faith. Now, if you know the story of Moses, you know how this part of the story ends. Pharaoh's fear of the other, his xenophobia, becomes so extreme that he decides that since the male children were being born alive, he would issue a decree that all male Hebrew children were to be taken from their parents' arms and thrown into the Nile River to drown. It is into that same river that Moses' mother will place him in a basket in order that he would be saved. That's where our story will pick up next week, and I can't wait to share the next chapter of this amazing tale. Amen.